change. So just 2 more minutes. I'm absolutely thrilled, and it's my immense pleasure to introduce Professor Marius Turda, our keynote speaker for the 3rd day of this conference. Professor Turda is professor and director of the Center for Medical Humanities at Oxford Brookes University. He was the founding director of the Cantemir Institute at the University of Oxford, the founder of the Working Group in the History of Race and Eugenics, and the founder of the Center for the History of Eugenics and Racism in Cluj. He is the author and editor of numerous books on the history of eugenics in East Central Europe and beyond. The range of his interests and his expertise is unbelievable. The titles of his books include Historizing Race, The History of East Central European Eugenics, 1900-1945, Sources and Commentary, Crafting Humans, From Genesis to Eugenics and Beyond, The Idea of National Superiority in Central Europe, 1880-1915, and Modernism and Eugenics. And this book was an inspiration for me when I got into the field of eugenic studies 10 years ago. That book, to me, was a game changer. Professor Turda is also the general editor of a very important collection that I believe will be a must across various disciplines. And this is recently published, Bloomsbury's A Cultural History of Race, published in 6 volumes. Professor Turda doesn't close himself in an ivory tower of academia, but shares his research with the public as well. Between 2018 and 2022, he curated 4 exhibitions on eugenics, racial anthropology, and biopolitics. We had the pleasure here at the University of Warsaw to host his exhibit on the international eugenics movement in April this year, and the same exhibit traveled to Vienna, Stockholm, Bucharest, and is traveling to Harvard, yes, soon. He was one of the main consultants for the acclaimed BBC documentary, Eugenics, Science's Greatest Scandal. When we asked Professor Turda to come here the 2nd time this year, despite his incredibly busy schedule, he accepted our invitation. As our mutual friend Benedict has told me, Marius is one of those guys that you can always count on. Having known Marius a couple of years now, I'm confirming this. His dedication to research and to the people hurt by eugenics discourse in the past and nowadays is truly humbling. Please welcome Professor Marius Turda.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Such a warm and generous introduction, and I'm very grateful and I am slightly humbled by the invitation. I was both honored and scared when I accepted. I was honored, of course, to be asked to come to speak to you alongside big names like Homi Bhabha and Jacqueline Bhabha, but also a bit scared because the topic is so important and it's so serious. It's not easy to really get across so many different generations and many different cultures. But I will try to share with you some of my views about this topic of identity. What is identity? Can it be measured and assessed through scientific or intuitive methods? Is it fixed or adaptable? Is it natural or cultural? Is it both? Generations of philosophers, writers, artists, and scientists have engaged with these questions, aiming to capture the essence of identity and to map its elusive boundaries. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Western and European scientists measured and dissected human bodies, aiming to demonstrate how brain size and weight, the shape of the skull, and cerebral circumvolutions differed between men and women, and between individuals belonging to different races. Countless terms were conjured up to diagnose and describe the existence of presumed markers of identity. The central argument of this race science was that observable and measurable variations found in the human bodies and brains reveal significant differences in their identity, what they are, whence they come, and whither they go. In the words of James Baldwin, these categories of identifications were meant to define and control the world for us. But the question, who controls the categories of identification, is critically important. As many scholars have pointed out, monopoly on the construction of identity is rooted in notions of collective historical progress and cultural predisposition to intellectual achievement. What further complicates any attempt to offer a satisfactory description of identity is the fact that it's not a static concept, whether used as a category of political analysis or to describe individuals, their beliefs and ways of life. Identity continues to pose challenges, not only to scholars, policymakers, and legislators, but also to the general public. For most people, a fixed biological identity is an attribute imbibed from infancy, safeguarded by family and the community. Many of us, in fact, accept this biological identity as a universal principle of nature. We rarely question it, especially when coupled with privileges due to gender, skin color, social class, or cultural affiliation. It is alleged that there is a permanent connection, one might say an ontological one, that binds people together. This connection, the argument continues, cannot be broken or transgressed. It is not transferable. A black person, we are told, cannot be white. A Jew cannot be a Pole or a German. A woman cannot be a man. One is born in a certain way that cannot be changed. In modern times, the cluster of ideas and different possible meanings associated with the expression born that way has had a major impact on how we think and act, on how we view ourselves and those with whom we interact. Others, however, are uncomfortable with their natural identity. They seek to question, challenge, and often abandon it in favor of other forms of self-understanding. They tell us that the idea of identity is not absolute, that is a product not of nature, but rather of the human mind. It is molded by the way people think and feel, and as such it requires human understanding, particularly when it seems to challenge conventional norms in society, such as female and male roles, the domination of one group of others, and so on. In some cases, as I'm sure you know, individuals lose their natural identity completely, or combine them with new ones acquired later in life, typically during adolescence or young adulthood. In other cases, the relationship between rich and poor people is naturalized and emphasized as an essential biological constituent of society. Within such contexts, cultural identities function as impenetrable demarcation lines between social classes. And then, of course, are those who refuse to identify themselves in natural or cultural terms altogether, claiming to be personally unclassifiable. Identities are shifting as our presence in geographical, cultural, religious, and social spaces is continuously reconfigured and rearranged. When we think of identity, we think of gender, sexuality, class, age, generation, ethnicity, and geography. We all have various layers of identity which are constantly in flux, interacting, expanding, retracting, and shifting in intensity throughout our lives. As many of us would agree, I think, identity cannot be thought of in hermetic isolation. Both personal and collective identity is experienced through a perceptual framework derived from inherited traditions of sociability and belonging. Possessing a sense of belonging enhances the human experience by shielding the individual away from isolation and connecting them to a larger whole, be it family, a group of friends, the nation, Western civilization, humanity. But this is necessary for creating meaning in life. Time and again, identity is politicized. This sometimes results in horrendous outcomes, particularly at moments of social and political crisis. Outsiders, others, foreigners, and immigrants are seen as unwelcome intruders into the community and are targeted as scapegoats. In such moments, identity is used to build a defensive wall around the community, fueling processes of inclusion and exclusion of us and them. Norwegian social anthropologist Friedrich Barth suggested the same interpretation already in the late 1960s. Human groups, he argued, tend to define themselves not by reference to their own characteristics, but by exclusion. That is, by comparison to the other. Imagination also plays an important role here. When scientific measurements and cultural categories of identification fail to demonstrate any significant differences between individuals, the answers are found in the realm of imagination. For those bent or more radical forms of identity, culture, and in particular language, does not create a sufficient resistant barrier between us and them. Languages could be learned after all. In some countries, the immigrants or the refugees today are deemed unable to cross the symbolic boundaries of the host country's culture, since their identity, their difference, is permanently stamped into their body. And thus, the category of identity spills over into other spheres. Different religious beliefs and customs are seen not merely as representing different identities, but as threats to the host country's own beliefs and values. Such beliefs are deeply entrenched across the world. They continue to be derived from the importance of natural identity in terms of lineage, family, genealogy, and blood ties. For many of us, these ties continue to be solid markers of both individual and collective identity. To be sure, what is perceived as historically significant changes with the passage of time. In other words, In order to understand how identity continues to impact our lives, we must explore it, not only within its current social context, both real and imagined, as prompted by our daily interactions, but also within its conceptual territory acquired progressively throughout time, but also through the advances in human and natural sciences. Identity is neither a simple natural entity based upon the sum of one's biological characteristics, nor is it just the outcome of cultural and social imagination. It contains both nature and nurture. As a subject of scholarly inquiry in the humanities alone, identity has unsurprisingly generated a tremendous amount of historical, ethnographic, literary, and philosophical literature. Marx, Darwin, and Freud are often mentioned today as initiators of new and compelling ways of understanding modern identity. Certainly, they changed the way we understand who we are and how we think. But there's another 19th century figure who made an important contribution to wider debates about modern identities, and his name is Sir Francis Galton. It is to his work that I now turn. A Victorian polymath, Galton was proficient in many scientific disciplines, including statistics, anthropology, psychology, forensics, and meteorology. He is well known today as the founder of modern eugenics, which he defined as the study of agencies under social control. They may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. Galton envisioned his theory of eugenics as an interpretation of the scientific truth revealed in Thomas Malthus' work on population, Herbert Spencer's social philosophy of competition and the survival of the fittest, and Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He believed it necessary not only to extend knowledge about nature and nurture, but also to intervene directly in the engineering of society using selective breeding. Equally importantly, Galton coined the phrase nature and nurture. In a book published in 1874 entitled Englishmen of Science, Their Nature and Nurture, he argued, in the competition between nature and nurture, when the differences in either case do not exceed those which distinguish individuals of the same race living in the same country under no exceptional conditions, nature certainly proved the stronger of the two. We are, according to Galton, a synthesis of nature, heredity, and nurture, environment, in which the biological condition of the present intersects trajectories of past inheritance. But it is important to know that although Galton highlighted the primacy of heredity in shaping character, behavior, and intelligence, other eugenicists insisted equally on the role of education and environment. Today, when hearing about eugenics, people often become alarmed and distraught, and justifiably so. The historical facts lend themselves to this reaction. In the name of eugenics, hundreds of thousands of people were institutionalized and sterilized. Euthanasia was performed on children with disabilities, and unethical human experiments were conducted in Nazi concentration camps. At the same time, and throughout the 20th century, sexual and ethnic minorities were targeted, their identities questioned, and their lives constantly supervised. Furthermore, socially disadvantaged people were believed to be defective and unfit. They were described as biologically unworthy of reproduction. And any inventory of the abusive acts committed in the name of eugenics would be incomplete without mentioning indigenous and non-white people across the world who are subjected to humiliating racial research to evidence their assumed inferiority. A practice also extended to ethnic minorities in Europe, such as the Roma. I certainly cannot do justice to the entire spectrum of eugenic thinking developed between the 1880s and 2020s. Now, but let's see if we can unpack some of its historical elements in regard to our discussion an identity. The second half of the 19th century, was a period of colonial expansion and scientific ambitions. The global dominance of Britain, Europe, and the United States was believed to be the result of centuries of Western advancement in culture, science, and industry. This narrative of entitlement, cemented by the Enlightenment, was further bolstered by an unyielding belief in race as an ordering principle of the world. Such a belief placed white peoples at the top of the hierarchy based on the assumed moral and intellectual superiority, whilst viewing non-white peoples as predominantly inferior. Emerging around the same period was the growing concern over the perceived demographic decline of certain groups of white peoples, the so-called Nordic and Anglo-Saxon. This intersected with an assumed loss of their biological vitality due to miscegenation and self-inflicted degeneration associated with alcoholism, prostitution, and poverty. Galton's use of the language of heredity informed the strategy he devised to protect British society against the menacing spectre of what they called mentally defective people. In so doing, he only endorsed marriages between those who possessed the finest and most suitable natures, mental, moral, and physical. He also argued that people perceived to be socially and intellectually below average should not have children. Otherwise, he continued, if this group procreates, a time may come when such persons would be considered as enemies of the state. For these individuals, Galton's vision was a language of doom. But for a selected few, especially those assumed to be hereditarily endowed with superior intellectual traits, it was one of promise. Eugenics fundamentally transformed the debate about the significance of nature and nurture in regard to individual and collective identity. Natural qualities in people were objectified and believed to determine not only one's behavior and desirability, but also one's intellectual performance and economic productivity. In short, one's contribution to society. Various members of the population were considered biologically and socially valuable, whilst others were not. Eugenicists argued that in the name of the common good, it was necessary for these individuals to be weeded out, or at least to be excluded from the normal rhythm of society. Following the rediscovery of Mendel's laws of heredity in the 1900s, many eugenicists believed that heredity had reasserted its supremacy, its constancy, and its universality. As William Ing, Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, put it in his article entitled Eugenics and Religion, published in 1921, we are on the side of Dame Nature. Notions of cultural progress, intellectual achievements, racial protectionism, biological decline, social pathology, and criminal behavior were all infused with the belief that it was the quality of the person's heredity that determined their existence. Even those who questioned the dominance of heredity and believed that nurture, education, and social context influenced and modified identity often blurred the distinction between biological and cultural heredity in accepting that individuals were not equal in terms of their intellectual achievements. To correct the outcome of successful generations of unfortunate matings or mating choices through education and environmental improvement was deemed to be too costly and rather ineffectual. Instead, the solutions preferred by the eugenicists, such as sterilization, segregation, and legislation against immigration and miscegenation, were seen as more practical and were imagined having an immediate effect on society. Eugenicists complained that modern society, with all its technological and medical advances, was allowing too many individuals with a defective identity to reproduce. They targeted those who were considered to be substandard and subnormal, either due to their physical or mental disabilities, or because their social and racial origins, so they were non-white, positioned them in less privileged positions. In his 1951 Cavendish lecture to the West London Medical Society, Ernst Barnes, Bishop of Birmingham, described these people as inferior human strains. He certainly did try to shock his audience, suggesting that even those who have largely abandoned our old religion traditions cannot bring themselves to allow the legitimacy of any form of euthanasia. They will not even allow the elimination of subnormal or defective individuals whose life becomes a tragic burden to themselves and the community. No, that's all right. I know, I completely understand that. So please, do not be shy. Leave. I completely understand. Thank you very much for coming for the first half. Thank you. Here, then, is an apparent paradox. Religious leaders who embraced eugenics and eugenicists who used religious language to communicate their message. Galton himself suggested that in order for eugenics to be introduced into the national conscience like a new religion, as he put in a paper he read before the London Sociological Society in 1904, there was need for an exploration of both morality and science, pursued simultaneously and without separating nature from nurture. Yet believing in the growing acceptance of Darwinism and thus a new scientific doctrine about the origins of man, Galton sought to limit the domain of organized religion in shaping identity, envisioning a role for science instead. The goal of Galtonian teaching, his disciple, statistician Carl Pearson, noted, was the conversion of Darwinism into a religious precept, a practical philosophy of life. Eugenics teetered on religion in a number of ways. Firstly, as the offspring of Darwinism and positivism, eugenics revised the traditional Platonic Christian model of physical identity, in which the body was devalued as fallen and corrupt, and ultimately dismissed as insignificant. Secondly, eugenics embraced the pre-Christian ideal of muscular identity and bestowed importance upon the able body in the establishment of a new vision of humanity. Thirdly, the eugenicists wanted to be not just a prophet of a new religion, of a new identity, but a priest as well. This is evident in Eugenics as a Religion, a text which the American eugenicist Charles Davenport prepared as a sermon for the Golden Jubilee celebration of the Battle Creek Sanitarium held in 1916. In it, Davenport offered an 11-point creed which included commandments such as, I believe that I am the trustee of the germplasm that I carry, that this has been passed on to me through thousands of generations before me. Or, another one, I believe in such a selection of immigrants as shall not tend to adulterate our national germplasm with socially unfit traits. The obsession with a particular male, white, able identity is evident here. Because they were born that way, individuals targeted by eugenics were excluded from the norms of society and condemned to medical interventions of varying ethnicity, including sterilization and euthanasia. A sense of contagion was attached to them all, requiring a degree of segregation from the mainstream of population. The terms used to describe these individuals we recognize today as exceptionally offensive. A book published in 1914 and entitled Human Derelicts is but one of many examples of how eugenic objectification and dehumanization occurred. In his foreword, Sir Thomas Clouston, former president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, of Physicians of Edinburgh, wrote the following: the ocean of life is strewed with human derelicts of every kind. Some of these are wrecks, are rudderless, some waterlogged. Some have broken masts and spars, and some are turned turtle. All are helpless crafts, unable to pursue the voyage of life. All are sources of danger to other wayfarers. It was assumed that by keeping the hereditarily tainted away from public view, social problems such as poverty, crime, and prostitution would be brought under control. For instance, a 1914 report prepared for the Board of Charities and Corrections of the state of Virginia affirmed categorically that various forms of disability, crime, and pauperism were connected to mental deficiency. This, in turn, was believed to be hereditary and a threat to the future of the race. The report also relied heavily on the work of psychologist Henry Goddard. From 1906, Goddard was director of the training school for feeble-minded boys and girls in Vineland, New Jersey. He's credited with introducing the intelligence tests, later called the IQ tests, produced by French psychologists Alfred Binet and physician Theodore Simon, to the United States. One of his most well works is The Kallikak Family. And this is the story of an 8-year-old girl named Emma Wolverton, fictitiously named in the book Deborah Kallikak. And Goddard studied her ancestry going back to a soldier in the Revolutionary War, endeavoring to prove that how feeble-minded was inherited and passed down through the generation, identifying it in one branch of the family. The notion of feeble-mindedness is evocative here. The Royal College of Physicians in London defined a feeble-minded person to be one who is capable of earning his living under favorable circumstance, but is incapable from mental defect existing from birth or from an early age of A, competing on equal terms with his normal fellows, or of managing himself and his affairs with ordinary prudence. British psychologist George Shuttleworth, author of a hugely influential treatise on the so-called mentally defective children, described the mentally feeble child as incapable of comprehending abstractions. All instructions, therefore, must be presented in a concrete form, which he can only see, but when possibly grasp in the hand as well as in the mind. In 1908, the Royal Commission on the Care and Control of the Feeble-Minded, established in 1904, published its report in 8 volumes. Among its findings, the report established that 150,000 people in England and Wales were suffering from mental defect, unhappy in themselves, a growing source of expense and burden to their families, and a growing source of expense and danger to the community. Following the recommendation of the Commission, a Mental Deficiency Act was passed in Parliament in July 1913. It codified 4 categories of people: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, and moral imbeciles. In a 1927 amendment to the Act, the latter category was renamed moral defectives. The Act also outlined the obligations of local authorities in the establishment of special institutions for mental defectives. It was assumed that by separating these people from the community, social problems will be brought under control. I want to suggest that this turning point arising during the first 2 decades of the 20th century coincides with the development of a medicalized language to describe people with intellectual and learning disabilities. Alas, a terminology which has survived to this day. With its objectifying and stigmatizing gaze, eugenics distinctly shaped the modern ideal of physical fitness and intellectual superiority, and with it of an abled society, one in which those individuals who were seen as a different humanity were relegated to institutions, special educational programs, and marginal social spaces. They were not considered valuable members of the body politic. Many health, social, and legal experts believing in eugenics prompted the state to adopt their justification for the eugenization of daily life. Ideas of economic and social productivity also flowed readily from eugenic arguments, since if an individual was to be socially unfit, it was appropriate, the eugenists argued, for he or she to be eliminated. The identity of the unfit had become synonymous with the new eugenic iconography, popularized through lectures, fairs, prose, plays, art, and design, radio addresses, films, and of course, exhibitions. By the early 1910s, notions of good and bad heredity were familiar enough to be taken seriously by those contemplating marriages, and many Americans followed such eugenic advice. In February 1914, Benjamin Bell and Laura von Slyke became the first couple in California to produce medical certificates before marriage, proving they were both of good physical and mental health. The improvement of nations' health began with choosing your wife or your husband wisely. This decision incorporated both nature, good ancestry, and nurture, good environment. But it was not only premarital and preconception screening, counseling of individuals and prospective parents which eugenicists wanted. They also wanted to assess the genetic quality of the children resulting from eugenic marriages. The first Better Babies contest was held in 1908 at the Louisiana State Fair. It soon became a popular event across the United States. Fitter family contests allowed not only for the collection of a detailed family information needed for eugenic research, but also for the public's education about human reproduction and desirable genetic traits. Concerns with infant and maternal health often intersected with natalism and the eugenic representation of white women's bodies as blessed and superior. In a world increasingly obsessed with the ideal body, fitness became, to paraphrase Stuart Hall, a eugenic signifier. A normative definition of what meant to be truly human, that is Anglo-Saxon American, was thus proposed and widely disseminated in popular culture. The nation's eugenic and racial health mattered, and mattered greatly. I want at this point to expand a bit my analysis and to focus on another very sensitive issue. Eugenicists thought to take reproductive power from men and women with tainted heredity in an attempt to centralize and control it. In doing so, they advertised themselves as purists, as the guardians of society's moral behavior, promoting sexual control, cleanliness, and the ideal of married life. Yet women were particularly targeted. At first poor, white, then increasingly African American, Hispanic, Native American, Indigenous, and Roma women are forcibly sterilized. I'll give 3 well-known examples out of many that could be cited. Carrie Buck, a white woman, 1927. In a carefully orchestrated legal case, presided over by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the United States Supreme Court sanctioned Carrie's sterilization on grounds of heredity, and they called her feeble-minded, under the authority of the Eugenical Sterilization Act of 1924. Carrie's sister was also sterilized by Virginia officials in 1928. Referring to Carrie's mother and daughter, Holmes wrote what must be, surely, some of the most ignominious words in history. He said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Second case, Elaine Riddick, an African-American woman, 1968. When she was just 14, Elaine was forcibly sterilized by the Eugenics Board of North Carolina after she gave birth to her son. The Eugenics Board declared her feeble-minded and promiscuous and sterilized her without consent. And finally, Elena Gorolova, a Czech Roman woman, 1990. Elena was forcibly sterilized at the age of 21 at the maternity hospital in Ostrava during the birth of a second son. Her consent to the procedure was obtained by asking her to sign papers while crying from intense pain during labor, without the doctor or the nurse providing her an explanation of what it would mean. As the last 2 examples demonstrate, sterilization programs targeted women of color and ethnic minorities were not stopped after the Holocaust. In the state of North Carolina alone, from 1929 to 1974, almost 7,600 people, many of whom were Black Americans, were sterilized. In fact, many scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, geneticists, and bioethicists remain attached to eugenics after 1945. And here are 2 examples I want to give. One comes from England, a very important psychiatrist. In 1946, his name is David Henderson. In 1946, David Henderson, he was professor of psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh and superintendent at the Royal Edinburgh Hospital for Nervous and Mental Disorders. Gave the presidential address at the annual meeting of the Royal Medical Psychological Association, which is the predecessor body of the current Royal College of Psychiatrists. And Anderson argued that post-war psychiatry aimed to fulfill two interrelated goals. Firstly, to understand the science of man, and secondly, to maintain the mental health of the individual so as to enable him to conduct his life at the highest level of efficiency. Psychiatrists, in turn, needed to study how nature and nurture can be synchronized and controlled. That meant, according to Henderson, the application of a wide social program dealing with the quality of the race and the conditions under which we live. Reading these lines, it is hard not to ponder the similarities between Henderson's views on psychiatry and those of Francis Galton and eugenics. Henderson made the influence explicit, after all, noting that Galton had long ago argued for a program of racial improvement through an assessment of backgrounds in relation to personal and family qualities. He also cited approvingly Galton's complaint that this land is overstocked and overburdened with the listless and incapable. During the 1960s, crude notions of an inherited germplasm were replaced by the more specific genes. And again, the scientific identification of good and bad genes and their social validation became intertwined. The architects of post-war welfare, healthcare, social assistance programs lamented the difficulty of fixing the outcome of successful generation of unfortunate mating choices through education and environmental improvement. None other than Theodosi of Dobzhansky, one of the architects of the modern synthesis, suggested that because many genetic defects were too costly to correct, sterilization was advisable. As he put it in his 1916 Mankind Evolving, persons known to carry serious hereditary defects ought to be educated to realize the significance of this fact if they are likely to be persuaded to refrain from reproducing their kind. Or, if they're not mentally competent to reach a decision, their segregation or sterilization is justified. We need not accept a brave new world to introduce this much of eugenics. These defenders of post-war eugenics were keen to say that unlike Nazi racial hygiene, present and future eugenics would finally be scientific. According to them, eugenics could be democratic and based on the ethics of genetic control, according to which parents, with complete knowledge of the workings of heredity, would make their own reproductive choices. But here's another paradox. What if you're not comfortable with a decision your parents made for you? Most of us probably are, but let me give you an example illustrating the contrary. In 1986, the mother of a 24-year-old young Canadian woman with learning disability, referred to as Eve, went before the courts, seeking authorization to have her daughter sterilized. The young woman was starting dating, and the woman was concerned that she might fall pregnant because of her disability, and she was worried of that happening, and then she went in front of the court and asked that, please, can you sterilize my daughter? The case reached the Supreme Court of Canada, which ruled against the mother, ordering that persons with mental disability cannot be sterilized without their consent. This was a critical turning point in the struggle for recognition of rights of persons with intellectual disabilities in Canada. And it ended the practice of non-therapeutic sterilization of people with intellectual and other mental disabilities. As noted at the outset, the emergence of eugenics is intimately connected to specific historical circumstances, including empire, colonialism, and racism. But importantly, as I argued here, is also linked to a generalized debate about nature and nurture and the multifaceted nature of human identity. Eugenics biologized identity, turning the individual into an object of scientific regulation in order to determine his or her value for future generations. In doing so, it prioritized the life of individuals deemed hereditarily healthy and worthy, while simultaneously stigmatizing, marginalizing, and ultimately excluding those individuals deemed less so. The so-called dysgenic identity of these individuals was considered to be incompatible with the normative eugenic definition of identity. During the first half of the 20th century, eugenics made it possible to connect the notion of collective racial welfare with individual responsibility towards the nation. According to one prevalent eugenic diagnosis, the nation's biological body was constantly threatened by the fear of contamination, resulting from the dangerous mixing of different, often opposing, ethnic and biological categories. Translated onto the geopolitical stage, this perception created a certain biopolitical dynamic. Eugenic anxieties about the future of the nation were intimately associated with fears of absorption by neighboring nation states and by potential detrimental impact of growing enclaves of domestic ethnic minorities. While cultural and political elites became increasingly obsessed with the mission to create a rejuvenated nation which was culturally, spiritually, and racially homogeneous, the state resorted to coercive mechanisms such as discrimination, segregation, and ethnic cleansing, in order to protect its chosen members and eliminate those deemed socially, culturally, and ethnically different. In Nazi Germany, as you know, the program of eugenic and racial cleansing began with the T for euthanasia program and culminated in the Holocaust. Eugenics deeply influenced and transformed modern societies, and it did so by weaponizing nature and by radicalizing culture, and by promoting discrimination and inequality, and by turning one group against another. As it dehumanized individuals with disabilities, people of color, ethnic and sexual minorities, eugenics skillfully maneuvered its way into a position of power and authority by associating itself with a host of human concerns, such as human rights, reproductive or otherwise, environmentalism, ecology. It certainly helped that eugenics was constantly sustained by expert knowledge and bolstered by scientific research that poured out of institutes, universities, private and state organizations, and various government agencies. Eugenicists were considered scientists, and their advice and knowledge was praised as beneficial to society. This is the historical contingent conceptual matrix that must be appreciated in endeavoring to understand how natural ideas of identity are adopted and given cultural meanings, so as to become mutually reinforcing in the processes through which various individuals and communities are represented. That is, the processes in and through which the identity of cultural, linguistic, and social groups are differentiated biologically according to their eugenic worth. The nature-nurture debate, as we know it in the 21st century, has not changed significantly by comparison to the early 20th century, when it was often expressed through the language of eugenics and scientific racism. In the stereotypes, which still have currency today, we are not a world away from the attitudes of the eugenicists I mentioned earlier. Eugenic categories to describe individual and collective identity are however, misleading. All are reliant upon stereotypes, biases, and prejudices for an understanding and ordering of the world, which distinguishes normal from abnormal people, abled from disabled individuals, and so on. Certainly, there are noteworthy changes between these different historical contexts and periods, but there is also remarkable continuity in conceptions of eugenic stigma attached to people with learning disabilities, to people born in poverty, and to various ethnic and religious minorities. To continue to believe that a brave new world can be ethically pursued by any possible means, and that it would be achievable with a sufficient knowledge of genetics and the mechanisms of heredity, is to ignore how deep and wide eugenics has cut into our modern world. The belief that people can be classified by genetic attributes which they share with members of their own group, and the notion that race can be defined by scientifically identifiable and verifiable cultural and physical characteristics, continue to inform not just political behavior, but also genomic research and biomedical technologies related to such issues as gene therapy and the use of assisted reproductive technologies for eliminating disability. The development of genomics should not lead to the development of a scientific eugenics, but to its condemnation. The occurrence of recent events, especially the challenges posed by the COVID pandemic and the current war in Ukraine, bear particular scholarly significance for us. One of the outcomes of these events is a situation in which medical, cultural, and political discourses about identity, the future of the West, in both Europe and the United States, have been able to retain various eugenic theories and attach new meanings to them. In articulating such views, many amongst the general public, as well as the political class, assume that individual and collective identities need to be protected against those who are different. We often hear that European culture and European identity are destined not to survive these uncertain and frightening times of rising global terrorism, economic recessions, and mass movements of displaced people. Such pessimist scenarios of cultural erosions and vanishing civilization imitate, in fact, classical narratives of misplacement and decline, elaborated in previous centuries by such diverse authors as Arthur de Gobineau, Max Nordau, Madison Grant, Oswald Spengler. It's true, though, we have come a long way in fighting racial inequality and injustice, but we should try to understand past and present ideas of eugenics so that we can confront and expose them. We must put an end to the dehumanization of many people of color, of those with learning disabilities, and so on. We must stop the eugenic rationalization of their supposed backwardness, inferiority, and their flawed identity. Or to put this recommendation differently, repeating the American idealist philosopher Josiah Royce, and in tune with the theme of this Congress, I invite you to appreciate and respect those who seem to us somehow very widely different from ourselves in physical constitution, in temperament, in all their deeper nature, so that we are tempted to think of them as natural strangers to our souls, while nevertheless we find that they are stubbornly there in our world. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so very much for this very important lecture. Yeah, I think that the word is important is really in place here because it should come across as something that it's not just about history, but it's very, very current. Yes, and so one thing that I need to emphasize that Professor Marius Turda is one of the driving forces of what is now developing on this major international anti-eugenics forum, and that I think is a very, very important international initiative. Now, this is the time for questions.
Thank you very much for the fascinating lecture. And you very briefly mentioned the links of eugenics to certain other movements, like you said, the environmentalist movement and ecology. And I wondered if I could ask you to elaborate on that.
Thank you. Yeah, what I had in mind is the discussion emerging in the 1950s in countries such as America, where the ecology movement really took off. And the major books written on sort of ecology were written by the eugenicists. because obviously their interest was, as it is now in many ways, with overpopulation, the destruction of natural resources. So their concern with ecology and the future of the planet derives quite, in a way, naturally from their interest of the control of the population. So you have this sort of neo-Malthusian obsession combined with ecology and environmentalism emerging very strongly in the 1950s. And of course now, very few people would go back to the origins of sort of the ecology movement or environmentalism to actually dig out some of these fundamental problematic sort of origins of the movement, which actually generate or originate in the eugenic movement. This is not to negate the crucial importance of ecology or environmentalism, but only to highlight that even here, we have always to be aware how the complex vocabulary is being formulated and how it started, just in order to understand a bit better where the direction is going, just to be critically alert. So this is why I wanted to highlight that. That in itself deserves a conversation, hopefully at some point soon.
And if I can tap into this, Madison Grant, whose book Passing of the Great Race, Hitler was using after the Bavarian Putsch in jail, in prison. That's the guy, Madison Grant, American. He's one of the founding figures of the American conservation movement in the States.
Okay, thank you for this moving, very fascinating and moving lecture. I didn't get quite that bit about the impact of Platonism on the modern era eugenics. Could you please elaborate on this?
Oh, thank you. It's very important because for a number of reasons. Plato was considered to be one of the classical authors who put forward a eugenic utopia, as you know, probably. So there's always reference to Plato in terms of how he envisioned the perfect state or the perfect society, which was a eugenic society, which all of us delegated to specific functions, and reproduction was carefully supervised. So there is this reference to classical authors, particularly Plato, but there is also a reference in terms of the idealization of the classical beauty or the classical fitness. Many of these authors would return to these idealized forms of masculinity and femininity, and they would not use other versions of this humanity, but the one produced by the classical Greece, considered to be the epitome of what Western civilization had produced. And not surprisingly, Francis Galton shared this Victorian obsession with classical antiquity, and he chose eugenics, which basically comes from Greek, meaning well-born. He went back to that kind of Greek word to illustrate that connection. So that's one important direction. The other, of course, is the conflict within the debate about the importance of the human body within the Christian theological debate about how important the body is. Is it the soul or the body or both? And the whole debate about nature and nurture gravitates around that, because if, according to Christian doctrine, the body is insignificant or is sinful, right? It's through the body that we express our sins, but the soul can sort of transcend that and save us at the end. Then the eugenic rhetoric has to sort of save that from somewhere, because otherwise their effort to produce better people is not just a moral one, it's a proper anthropological one as well, right? They have to have the physicality, the ableness, and so on and so forth. So there's another way they went back to these debates. It's a very interesting philosophical conversation, which, again, like the conversation about ecology and environmentalists, would deserve a proper panel. And I wouldn't aim to do this justice in 2 seconds here, but I wanted to highlight that for those of you in the audience who are more philosophically inclined and want to go back to Plato or this discussion, to know that there is a very important tradition of discussing these issues that go back to this conversation.
Thank you for this fascinating lecture. I have a question about the Victorians and eugenics, and especially because Galton was a relative of Charles Darwin. I would like to ask about the entanglement of Victorian eugenicists with social Darwinism and the class structure, which was of course so important in Victorian England. How did they account for the fact that many people from the aristocracy and even the royal family would not be considered quote unquote worthy in their own book?
That's a very good point, and it reminds me of the conversation Polish and German eugenicists would have about the Habsburgs. You know, the form of degeneracy they found in the Habsburg royal house because they intermarried, and after all, of course, it was proven that by intermarrying for generations, you end up, you know, with debilitating genetic defects. And so, you know, the famous Habsburg nose, for example, or so there was an entire literature in Central Europe about the former royals and how degenerate they were. And they tried to combine that with the explanation, of course, that you know, they intermarried. And that conversation does exist in Britain as well to some extent, but it's more directed in a way to the discussion about not pursuing a direct continuation of their line. So Galton complains a great deal about the fact that these superior people don't want to have children, rather than attacking directly the Windsors or, you know, a particular sort of aristocratic family. In fact, he does believe that obviously there is enough diversity within the royal family, the aristocratic family, not the royal family, aristocratic families in England, Scotland, and Ireland to some extent, the old families, as they were called, that could actually allow for a survival of this aristocratic class. It is in decline, but it could survive. But however, he turned his attention very radically towards the opposite side of society when he would discuss sort of the inferior class or the working class people who were, of course, the main target of his attention were these people who proliferate too much, have too many children, but they are basically, with few exceptions, intellectually and socially unworthy because they are below average.
Thank you. Would you then say that it was the ideology of the middle class, essentially, in the view of, I don't know, hemophilia in the royal family, or the assumed madness of King George III, and so on? So
yeah, hemophilia is a very important topic in Eugenic literature. It appears not only in Britain. So these topics do appear. The madness of King George, it's more of of course, I mean, it is historically documented, but it's also part of the popular folklore, so popular culture. So this was discussed, but it wasn't necessarily part of a eugenic conversation about the decline of the monarchy or the royal house, in very specifically like that. It doesn't exist. But in relation to social Darwinism and upper middle class or middle class, certainly. I mean, the class element, and this it's absolutely clear here. And obviously, Galton is a half cousin of Charles Darwin, represents a particular family, very well established, very important, both economically and scientifically, on both sides of the family, Darwins and the Wedgwoods. And it was clearly an expression of his own class, what he felt that basically we're less and less, and there are more and more, and we need to do something about us. So that represented an initial start, as it were. But when you look across how it circulated, you know, across the world, then the class element, although it always appears, it's always reformulated. I mean, if you look at countries in Eastern Europe like Poland or Romania or Hungary, where you have a very strong class element, but it's never defined as class. But certainly, you know, people will know the difference between the rural and the urban and read that socially structured arrangement in a way that would be reminiscent of a debate about classes in another context. But he wouldn't use, and they didn't really use that directly here like that, for example, you see. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. It was always about how we defend ourselves and who is us anyway. That's the difficult question we always need to ask ourselves. Is it people like you and I, Or is it people like all of us in this room? Or when do you start making the selection and separate those who are us from those who are not us? That's very important, of course. And then, that's the ethical issue, I suppose, that we need to ask ourselves, or the moral issue we need to ask ourselves.
To bounce off Dorota's question, would inbreeding have been frowned upon regardless of the context, or, for example, only among the lower classes, you know, hillbillies in Virginia, and not among the royalty?
No, inbreeding was always frowned upon. So you're absolutely right. It is a classical eugenic problem. It doesn't matter whether you are, you know, the king or a peasant. You know, you should not really marry your sister. I mean, that was quite an understanding. However, it all depends on how this is socially constructed. Everything, ultimately, it's about how it is represented and constructed, you know. Because if you marry your sister in a poor village and then I construct an entire genealogy of degeneration and exterminate you after all, because it all goes back to that mistake you made in the past, it's one thing. If I say, well, it was a mistake, it will not happen again, and we move on, society moves on, and then the entire history is different, you see. So ultimately what matters here is that people make mistakes. All of us make mistakes. We're not, you know, perfect. The question is how I interpret that mistake, who controls that mistake, then who makes, you know, benefits from that mistake and reads me in that key. And this is what would happen with these people. I mean, there was no their fault that you were born in a certain way. Why would you be, you know, condemnable because you're born a woman, or because you're born black, or because you're born, you know, a Roma? But then, of course, I read that as a problem. I read that as a problem for you, and I construct an entire arrangement going back centuries, or where I can keep people, you know, like you, outside what I consider to be the normal definition or the normative definition of my community, you see? So hemophilia, intermarriages, first cousin marriages, all of these sort of things happen throughout history. It's about how we read these and include them in our sort of the canonical reading of our identity.
My question was actually coming more from my, animal background, because usually human eugenics is read as based on the principles of animal breeding, livestock breeding, as it developed in the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries. And actually this would be a difference, because for modern livestock breeding to come into being, I mean, it was based on inbreeding. That was one of the assumptions, that in order to establish type, you need to breed in and not out. So that would be a difference there.
I mean, apart from few sort of Nazi and white supremacists who believe in superiority of the purity, none of these eugenicists actually argue for the purity of the race, because they knew that much, that interbreeding is good for human populations. The question was not about interbreeding the same population. It was not about, white people interbreeding white people. It was when they tried to cross the ontological line, it became an issue. Or within the group, those people who, through generation and generation of interbreeding, which an animal breeder will tell you, after generations, the crossings become sterile. So then you have to change. So it's interesting that they always reflect on how, and not surprisingly, a lot of these eugenicists, particularly early 20th century, before genetics really became the dominant narrative, they went back to animal breeding. There was where, we can do this with horses and dogs. Why can't we do the same with humans? Sorry, I let hanging the question there, because you can believe people still saying that. So that was the model they followed, of course. And Darwin himself was extremely preoccupied, as you know, with animal breeding. And he tried various methodologies how to, cross and fertilize different from within, particularly pigeons. He was very fond of pigeons.
I have a question. Please forgive me for asking you this question, because I know that not too many people are aware of the existence what has been defined by Helen Richardson in the States as euthenics, and she called this female eugenics, and she was using actually the phrase that this is applied to eugenics, so there are two types of eugenics, and so she developed the whole notion of euthenics. And my question is, and that was in the States. My question is, how popular was euthenics, you know, and the term itself and the notion understood as female eugenics, you know, the female understanding or female application of eugenics, how popular was it also in Europe, in England, for example?
Yeah, this terminology didn't catch up. It was used, but there is another one actually was more efficient, which is called eugenic feminism. So Caleb Salovey, a very important British-Scottish gynecologist, and he writes about how eugenics empowers women. And then he proposes terminology, eugenic feminism. And that actually did catch. But euthenics was normally used as stuff, the eugenics of the environment, not as stuff so the eugenics of the education of the environment. So that would be in addition to eugenics. But it was a very difficult word to pronounce. I mean, even eugenics is kind of difficult because you're thinking of, you know, is this
what is it? To be Galton, you know,
yeah.
so she took euthenics.
Yeah, it didn't. Yeah, the only thing with this, you know, as you know, is not enough to be, you know, come up with a, you know, interesting theory. It has to have a catchy name. So
and maybe
when
you
hear,
have
you
to
know,
be
like
a man. You know, she was a professor of chemistry, but she wasn't.
No, euthenics existed already from the very beginning. It's not like she didn't suggest that it was not her coinage. No, it wasn't. Yeah, she claims, but it wasn't. So it exists in the interwar period. It's being used in interwar period. You have it in Central Europe. There are people using that. But then it's like you have positive, negative eugenics, eugenics, preventive eugenics, for example. So they like always say there are three types of, you know, eliminationist eugenics. You have racial hygiene, you know, race hygiene of reproduction. You have a really wide spectrum of terminology. Some of them are just completely, you know, out there. Others are more sort of connected to a real program of human improvement. But ultimately, you know, the purpose is still the same. You know, when you unpack all of this terminology and the vocabulary, what remains is the same idea. You know, some people are more valued than other people, and we want these people to be protected, to be, you know, looked after, and we define ourselves in accordance to those principles. But it's interesting that we mentioned the middle class there. So if you look at the British feminist eugenicists, and the same with the American eugenicists, all of them white middle class women, people like Marius or Margaret Sanger, they really did not like at all poor white women. They were not surprisingly, the entire development of the birth control movement was basically to stop poor women from reproducing. They did not like. So their feminism was not for the emancipation of all women, just about those women they believed to be, you know, worthy. And this is not even going out there to say what they felt about the black women, or in our case in history about the Roma women. And this is to this day. I mean, a great deal of Central European feminism is basically in no conversation at all with Roma women. So you have very prominent white feminists in Central Europe, which are completely unable to engage in a serious conversation and adopt anything that relates to other women who are not like them. And in our case here, or in this region, of course, that's clearly with the Roma women. And that's very evocative of how selective even a very progressive and emancipatory ideology or movement or corpus of ideas can actually be. And we have precedents to look at and say, well, right, you know, regrettably, emancipation is for some of us, but not for all of us. I mean, we're all equal, but some of us, as Orwell put it in Animal Farm, some of us are more equal than others.
For a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful talk. I'm sorry, this is what she claims.
If I may have one little announcement to the guest of our Congress, the session which was supposed to take place at 12 is cancelled because we had some very unexpected cancellations from our speakers. The paper by Olga Marina, Female Identities in the Dramatic Discourse of the English Restoration, will take place in session 6, so at 3 o'clock. So now we have a break in this room. You are very welcome to join our research group sessions. If you are not from the University of Warsaw, you are very welcome to perhaps visit the Warsaw Library, which is just across the street. And I want to remind you that at 6 o'clock we have our final debate, which is about trans identities, which is also going to take place in this room. Thank you very much.